I've wanted to make a video about the economic philosophy of classical liberalism. Classical liberalism, as postulated by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations and other writings, and in the 20th century, supported by the economist Milton Friedman, who was very controversial and at one point won a Pulitzer Prize, is a very old and unfortunately anti-democratic system. When you debate a right-winger online, because classical liberalism, what the strain of economics within the conservative American movement that comes to the forefront every few elections is fundamentally this sort of the idea is socially liberal, fiscally conservative, which is a platform that no one has won on in this country. We've never had, in the United States, the classical liberal ticket is referred to as the libertarian ticket. Originally, the term liberal had the same meaning in the United States in terms of the political spectrum as in other countries currently. In Europe, to be an economic liberal is to be interested in free markets, regressive taxation, imposed austerity, this sort of unfettered uber capitalism was rebranded when FDR co-opted the term liberal during the New Deal. So America is unique in terms of what it means to be liberal here. The concept of social liberalism gets conflated with economic liberalism, which are very, in my opinion, they are somewhat at odds, because you cannot create a highly unequal society economically, and with the implications that has for education, and expect to have a socially aware, socially progressive, liberal society. Economic progress is the mother of social progress in many cases, in many countries, and particularly in the United States. The poor segments of the population are generally more socially conservative, more Christian, more prudish on sexuality and abortion and stuff like this. Because when you're poor, all you have to cling to is the promise of a better life when all this is over, because this life does not contain anything for you. You just kind of work for this extremely low wage, and there's no health care. And this is reflected in the red states, where this philosophy, this economic policy of liberalization, deregulation, privatization of public land and resources, also referred to commonly as the commons, has taken root in the first world, at least in our country, in the United States of America. It's largely the red states that have embraced this capital liberalism, this capital liberalism, classical liberalism. So what's the history of classical liberalism on a global scale? Well, it is mostly an economic system that has been imposed through force. The first part of the liberalization program usually involves brutal austerity measures. These austerity measures are a form of sacrifice to the free hand of the market. What's funny to me is that more skeptics don't, as much as they claim that feminism is a religion that needs to be debunked by skeptics, I don't see many of them taking the religion of free market fundamentalism to task. Free market fundamentalism is a utopianist political economic system that disregards information that disagrees with its ideals. The history of these classical liberals are of a brutal occupying force that literally sacrifices the lives of poor people on the altar of the free market based on faith. What's fascinating to me about classical liberalism as a religious doctrine is the free hand of the market. You'll hear the short version of this often on Fox News. Trust the free market. Trust the hand of the market to correct things. It's not a coincidence that the number one proponents in the United States of this trust the market, put your faith in the markets economic policy is the conservative movement. The religious right has an ally, an ideological analog in this faith, and what I would call a similar form of snake oil to organized religion, this scam of trust me, hey, trust me. These charismatics, these demagogues really love, the classic term, people often lose the meaning of con man in its abbreviation, which is to say a confidence man. Or a confidence woman if you're Sarah Palin, or Ann Coulter, or Blair White. This is a person that profits from exploiting your confidence, your faith. Trust me, trust me, trust me. Every con person asks you to trust them as emissaries of an ethereal force, a sort of karmic justice. So the hand of the free market is, in economic terms, a form of karmic justice to be trusted. Let's do something that seems counterintuitive. Let's do something that no facts support, which is to dismantle the commons, to implement a tax policy that has been shown to destroy economies, not to lead to any form of relevant prosperity, which is to say, the economists who propose to follow the free market fundamentalism throughout history and even in the existing system today, basically endorse the idea that if we shove all the money to the top of the income scale, that it will come falling down like pennies from heaven. At least the last 40 years of statistics where iterations of this policy were implemented, because the mainstream Republican Party is smart enough to know that you cannot have a government, you cannot have a society without some form of welfare state. You cannot. The fringes of the American Republican Party will always emerge when mainstream conservatism, with its fealty to Christian dogma, loses its popularity. The classical liberals will assert themselves to shift the purity scale, the litmus test, from a religious purity test to an economic one. You'll even notice recently that Sarah Palin was criticizing Donald Trump as a crony capitalist, and more specifically, former Congressman Joe Walsh was making a point about someone explained to Trump how free markets work. Again, trust the market. Someone re-explained to him our dogma. Don't take any policies that step out of the religious texts of the free market. And these are basically books written by various economists from the Chicago School of Economics. You can look up the Chicago Boys online, and you can look up how they imposed a sort of experiment in third world countries during the 1960s and 70s. This would later be called the shock doctrine by the author Naomi Klein, where basically these economists would seize on the installation of third world dictators like Suharto in Indonesia and General Augusto Pinochet in Chile in the early 1970s during a coup where he murdered the socialist president of that nation, Salvador Allende. The Chicago Boys were a mixture of foreign and domestic economists who would wait for these coups, and through the World Bank and what's referred to as the troika of global finance, not the Rothschild conspiracy thing, but like the legitimate World Bank, would commit these post-coup governments to austerity programs which would slash the tax base, destroy the social safety net, and burden these new nations with massive debt, loans from the World Bank to finance infrastructure so that they could invest in infrastructure without taxing the wealthy in their own countries. Now, when you take on debt, instead of actually paying taxes, as we learned post George W. Bush, post Ronald Reagan, is you basically shift the burden for this spending, this debt, onto the working class and poor with through the deficit hawk stance, which is to say slash, slash, slash. tear Social Security down to the ground, cut food stamps, don't raise taxes, but pay the debt, which is a work of cognitive dissonance worthy of any religion in terms of the logic that binds those two ideas together, that we're going to pay down debt, but we are not going to collect revenue. So, classical liberalism, what's interesting in the YouTube space is that classical liberalism is feeding off the American definition of liberalism, which is generally economic progressivism, and social liberalism, also known as progressivism, and presenting it to people as socially liberal, fiscally conservative. That is, at best, a disingenuous representation of an unsustainable and anti-democratic economic system. It has never been implemented successfully. It proposes to completely destroy the American welfare state. If you want to see who the candidate was for the classical liberals in the last election, it was Gary Johnson. Look at Gary Johnson's economic platform within the Libertarian Party, and he is more generous than some of his predecessors. Ron Paul, who was the sort of Ralph Nader of the right in this country, he was a libertarian candidate, and he was proposing an even more ruthless austerity program and grotesquely regressive taxation scheme. So don't buy the religion of free market fundamentalism. It is being repackaged for the first time as not conservative and not right-wing, which it fundamentally is, by people like Dave Rubin,